So welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Functions and Practices webcast, and this time we're going to talk about the calling Azure AD secured APIs from SharePoint Framework. And this is a capability which was released as part of the SharePoint Framework 1.6, or technically it went to GA as in general availability in 1.6. It was originally released in the 1.4.1 version to preview earlier in 2018. So the capability itself is now in production ready status, and you're able to start using this within your tenant as well. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from Microsoft, and with me today, responsible also for the demo, right, Waldek, is Waldek Mastergaard.
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Waldek Mastergaard. I work at Rancor. I am Office Development MVP, and today we will talk about calling Azure AD secured APIs from SharePoint Framework.
Excellent. So before we go to the actual steps and walking through what this actually means, so just to quickly clarify, this is really, so to say, the holy grail of the SharePoint Online development, because using this capability, you are able to call securely a web API which is hosted in Microsoft Azure. And then it's up to you what that web API is doing. So you're able to, for example, access your line of business data from on-premises, or you're able to access whatever SQL or database data in Azure, or you're able to get data to Azure for processing and all of that stuff. So this is really around being able to delegate the business logic from the SharePoint Framework web part or component directly to an API, which has then more processing power in Azure. And that sounds exciting, doesn't it, Waldek?
Absolutely. I mean, that's when you think about it, it's what you really want to have in order to really benefit of the portal that you build, right? Because sure, you will have some of the data directly in SharePoint, but you will still have some of the data in your LOB. And at some point, to integrate that and allow the users to have a central location to access all of that, you will need to bring some of the data to the portal, and this is exactly the way to do it, right? So Absolutely. You will surface the data through an API, and that API will not be anonymous because you don't want anybody and everybody to be able to call it. And then from the portal, you will do a secure call, authenticate and authorize, and show the data in portal.
Absolutely, yeah. So maybe potentially in the later scale, or previously might have actually done something like replicating the relevant data to a SharePoint list and then surfacing that. That could have been one way of doing that. This way, you can actually then use caching and all of that capabilities also in the Azure Web API side. So really design the access to the information and taking advantage of Azure capabilities for your benefits in a secure way. Anyway, now a lot of talking. So let's actually go through some slides. So what does it mean in practice? Pretty busy slide, but what it actually means is that, so let's go through the steps of using the Azure AD HTTP client. So Azure AD HTTP client is the wrapper or abstraction class for using or calling a third-party web API in a secure way. So we also need to have first the third-party web API hosted in Azure AD or hosted in Azure subscription. And the exact setup on that one slightly depends on then if the API is a multi-tenant API or is it per tenant API or per tenant installation. So are you using a multi-tenant API exposed by somebody else, or are you actually exposing the API only for you within your tenant? Both options are available, and you can securely call both APIs. After administrative operations administrator has approved that API to be available. Now, the second step is also writing the needed code, which is then using the Azure AD HTTP client to access the API. Then to be able to get the approvals on the SharePoint side, you will need to request needed scopes or needed approvals, so to say, in the package solution.json file. So in the solution file of your SharePoint Framework component. After this, we upload the SPPKT file to the app catalog. Well, obviously, we'll package the solution first, but then we upload the SPPKT file to the app catalog. And then administrator in that tenant will need to approve the additional scopes using the modern admin UI or SharePoint Online Management PowerShell, or actually Office 365 CLI as well. So that's definitely an option as well. And then you basically are able to use the SharePoint Framework components, and you can definitely have a look on the HTTP calls and traffic, how the scopes and permissions are actually working. Now, anything you want to add there, what we missed on the list of things?
Well, you didn't really miss it, but I think that it's important to underline that for the first step, when you choose whether you want to have a multi-tenant or single tenant app, another factor that you have to take into account that sometimes a company might have different AAD tenant than they have 365 tenant. So as such, even though it's single company, they would still need to use a multi-tenant app because the AAD from Azure is in a different tenant than the AAD that is attached to their 365 environment.
Correct. Because in this case, we call it as a tenant, but it's an Azure AD tenant, basically.
Correct.
Well, every single tenant has an Azure AD behind of them. And like I said, you might have multiple subscriptions. Multiple subscriptions means then multiple,
exactly.
Potentially multiple tenants, and that might add additional complexity.
Multiple AADs, and as such, multiple or multi-tenant apps, so that the app from AAD can be used, or the app from Azure tenant can be used in your 365 tenant.
Absolutely. Now, let's have a look on the logical architecture of this one. So how does it actually work in practice? So technically what we have is in quotes, a SharePoint Online client in Azure AD. So the actual name is pretty long. We didn't update the slide for that because it doesn't actually fit on the slide.
Wouldn't fit.
Exactly. But there is already pre-provisioned application in your Azure AD, which you should never ever delete. That's like deleting the permissions. Deleting that will cause you significant problems. But what that is the application which we from Microsoft pre-provisioned for you, where you then grant the permissions. So the tenant administrator is the one who basically approves what kind of scopes and what kind of permissions are available for it. And that's then basically used for granting or defining the scopes and permissions for third-party web API. The same application is used by the Microsoft Graph client and also the AAD HTTP client behind of the scenes. Now, the application itself, and really important to think, we'll kind of talk about this one in the upcoming slide as well, but it's important to understand that this is a one application. So even though you might have multiple solutions and components in SharePoint Framework, we do not provision an automatic application for every single component or in the Azure AD. So there's only one application which we grant those permissions, and that has certain implications which we're going to talk about on the following slide. Now, what it also means is that the abstraction layer is taking care of the scopes and permissions. So basically, whenever you're then using the Azure AD HTTP client, we will take care of this, the access tokens and all of that for you. And then when you call a web API, you don't have to worry about taking care of the scopes and permissions as you're calling. So you don't have to explicitly get an access token and put it in the header. All of that is taken care of by us automatically. Anything what I'm missing here?
No. Well, we could go more in depth, and we probably will when we go to the next slide where we talk about different things that you have to take into account. But I guess for this part, this is clear, right? It shows you where permissions live, how do you retrieve them from the page, and how they are being used when you call the API eventually. So I would say that for now, let's keep the overview an overview. And then, and then go into more depth on the next slide.
On the next slide. Well, this isn't really going super deep on the topic, but few considerations when you're using the Azure AD HTTP client. So you will need to enable CORS, so the cross-origin resource. Come on. Sharing. Cross-origin resource sharing. Thank you, Walter. For the API. So basically what this means that you're enabling explicitly that API to be available in SharePoint.com or in your tenant. So otherwise you will run into an issue because it's it's being hosted in a different URL in a different domain, and that by default the browsers don't like that unless you have a CORS definitions enabled on the API. That's basically what it is. You will need to also have the tenant administrative permissions, so to approve the additional scopes or permissions for the API. So basically, whenever the solution is getting added on the app catalog, there's then a request for the needed permissions before the app web part will work. And you will need to have a tenant administrative permissions to be able to do that. Because you need to go to the modern UIs or use the SharePoint Online PowerShell or the CLI to make those happen. like mentioned on the previous slide, all of these granted permissions apply to all JavaScript components running in a tenant. So you as a tenant administrator, you need to be aware of that. So those permissions are then available for all of the SharePoint Framework applications. So the permissions are not only for one component which is requesting them. Theoretically, technically, they are available for any component in the tenant who can access that information. Now, in the future, there will be a few different cool new capabilities available in SharePoint Framework where you can isolate the components and all of that, but that's a different topic, and we're going to talk about that one in a separate webcast. And then this capability is available across all of the tenants starting from early September, well, mid-September 2018. So as part of the SharePoint Framework 1.6 release, this capability went to the GA, general availability across all of the tenants. Anything what I'm missing here?
I think the one important thing, why would you care? Why, being developer, would I care about this? And wouldn't I want to run my own OAuth flow with ADO?
Well, it's the simplicity of things. Absolutely. It's an abstraction layer for simplifying things for you to really call the web API in the solution level, in the web part level or extension level. The needed level of code is basically nothing as long as the permissions have been managed or approved. The plumbing is taken care of completely under the hood. Anything else
Cool.
what you would say on?
Well, I think that wraps it up, and also abstracts away all of complexity, like with the return URLs, handling that,
Sure.
handling the fact that multiple things on a page can call out the same or access token for the same resource at the same time, and you need to take care of that. There can be multiple web parts on multiple things on a page that want an access token, and so there are quite a few things that you have to take into account. And if you use this, you don't need to worry about any of that, and you can just focus on your application and not worry about the different things. Exactly.
Yeah.
So this saves you a lot of time and complexity.
Absolutely. Now, few slides, and let's actually jump into the demo. So let's jump on Waldeck's computer, and let's have a look on this one in practice. So how do we use this? How do we enable the Web API in Azure AD, and how do we call the Web API from our components? So let's keep the sample relatively simple for a simplicity perspective, so you understand the basics, but then we will definitely record more complex samples around this scenario in the future as well. But let's jump on Waldeck's computer. Boom.
Demo. All right, so let's have a look in practice how you would call to an API, an LOB API that you have built, which is secured with AD from your SharePoint Framework web part. So here we have an API, and that just illustrates, let's say, a system that gives you insights into orders. So we can call that, and that doesn't do much now, but it's not really the point what it does. The point is that it's an API secured with AD, which you cannot access anonymously. Yeah. So I grab the URL, and let me just paste that in a tab, and here we can see that it works. And we will, if all is well, we will get error. So this is by design. This is good. This is actually the fact that because we didn't specify the headers, the output is in XML, but because the objects that we return back are things like dates and objects, XML cannot format them. So this is by design. This is nowhere here. But the fact is that now if we call the same API anonymously, we will get a prompt to authenticate first. And this is good, right? So this point proves the point that this API is secured with AD.
How did you do that? Sorry. How did you secure that with an Azure AD?
So here we have a function app, which we use to build this API. And here, if you go to authentication, here are all the options that you can use in Azure Functions to secure your API with AD. So here in we go that we say the authentication is enabled, and when there is an anonymous call to it, let's redirect to a AD page, right? And here we have the AD option enabled. So if we go to that, and let me quickly switch to Express mode so that it's easier for us to see the application that we have. And in here, let me go to the app. So in here, we can see the underlying Azure AD app that we use to actually secure this API with AD.
So if you would write your own, if you would write your own web API and you would just host that with an application, this would be the page basically. There's always an application.
You would go exactly step by step through the same blaze, going in here first. So you would start here. Initially, that would be set to off. You would enable that to on. You would enable AAD because that would be off, and you would just go step by step through all of them. And if your AAD, if the function is located in the same tenant as 365 environment, then you don't need to worry about any of that. You would just click next, 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 finish, done. And you wouldn't need to worry about any of that because that would be the single tenant app.
Yeah.
If it's not, well, that is there are a few additional steps, and we won't delve into them now, but we'll have additional webcasts, I think, where we'll talk about it, right?
Yep.
And in here are a few important bits and pieces to which we will get in a moment, as we will build the web part and register all the different parts that we need to have in there for the whole setup to work. So this is our API. We leave it for now as is. We haven't changed anything here. So this is exactly what you would say, what you would see if you would go through a wizard.
Yep.
So now let's go to the code. And in here, I have a SharePoint Framework 1.6 project with a web part. And I've built all that so that you don't need to see me code. But we will talk about the important pieces that we have. So we start with granting permissions or requesting permissions to this API. Because by default, we are not allowed to access that. So in order for a web part or an extension to be able to call out an LOB API secured with AAD, it has to request permissions to it. And it can either be done per package, or you could grant this API access up front. In this case, we want to include the request inside a package. So here we add 2 lines. We add the Web API permission request section. And in there, for each API that we want to access, for each scope, permission scope we want to have, we add an entry, which you see here. So in our case, we want to access our API, which is secured with an app named after a tenant. So it's like M365X 035040-API, and this is exactly the API or the app name, which you see here. So you go to display, you go to settings, properties, and here you have the name. So it has to be this name. Like initially in preview, you had the option to either use a GUID, this one here, or the name, and they would work both. With GA, you can only use the name. If you will use a GUID, when trying to approve the permission request, you'll get error. So always use application name. So that is one. And then 2, you need to specify which permission scope you want to have access to, right? So for example, if you think about it like in Graph, you can have access to read email, read calendar, read task, create task, and all that. In our API, it depends what your API implements. Permissions that are available for your API, you can see them in manifest. So here we click to manifest. And when you scroll down, there is a property named all-of-2 permissions. And in this case, you can see that we only have one, which is the user impersonation. If your API had distinction between, for example, read and write, create orders, share orders, and all that, they would be available here, and you would be able to request them in your package. But in our case, we only want the access. We don't authorize to API. We only need to authenticate. So as such, we only have this one scope, which we then include in package in here. So now this part is done, and we will deploy the package to catalog. We will issue a permission request, which the tenant admin can then approve or reject. So this part is done. Next, we go to our code. In web part, we want to be able to call the API using the AAD HTTP client, and the first step towards that is to create an instance of client that is tied to our API. Because when you think of it, each API, the way it works is that it's always tied to a resource secured with AAD that you want to access, right? Because each of them has different ID. So when you get an instance of AAD HTTP client, you specify immediately to which resource it is tied. In our case, that's the one for orders. And when you retrieve the instance using the AAD HTTP client factory, you pass in the ID of the AAD app for which you want to have access. So in our case, the 09C AB4 GUID matches the application ID which we have here, 09C AB4. So this is so it's not the object ID, is the app ID which we see here. So this is the one that we have here in code, and then when we obtain the instance, we store that in variable. And we do all of that in webpart init, so that everything that follows already has the access to the client. And then eventually, when the webpart loads, we call the API, and at that stage, we don't need to worry about headers, redirect URLs, all of that. All of that is already being done for us. Yeah. So at this stage, the only thing that we have to do is to issue a request, in our case, get to the endpoint, API orders, and then we have immediately access to all of the info given us by the API. So this is it. Now the next stage is to package it up, deploy it to SharePoint, and then we can walk through the process of requesting the API permissions, approving them, and all of that. So I already have a package. I created that up front, which is here. So here is
run the gulp package solution.
Gulp build, gulp package, yes. Yep. And so here we have the package, and let's go in here to our app catalog, and we will deploy really easily simply by doing drag and drop.
That's really modern. No,
it's easy. It just works. Important part. Because in our case, we requested an API permission access, we see the warning here.
Yep.
Right. So this makes it clear to the admin or the person deploying the package that this package requests access to APIs, and they should at least review it. So it doesn't say you need to approve it. No, review it. If you are okay with that, giving everything that you understand that when you approved it, it will apply to all scripts across your whole tenant and all that, then you can decide where you want to allow it or not. But this is the warning you have to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And now one thing to notice on this screen is that whenever you now click deploy, well, let's check the tenant scope deployment and then click deploy, this web part is immediately available in the modern pages. But it's not yet working because we haven't actually granted the permissions. So
Correct.
From a timing perspective, whenever you're deploying this, you should already now have the tenant administrator or the person who has sufficient amount of permission, the permissions to approve the permissions already waiting for you. So, or you'll be the same person and you will go and approve that, because otherwise end users might be highly confused on, hey, what is this? Why isn't it working? And the second dimension is also the developer should consider the fact that they might actually not have the permissions. So
Correct.
for a certain time, it might be that the web part isn't working.
Correct. Also, another important thing to check here under deployed, yes, and that there are no errors.
Absolutely.
Right? And valid. Right. So if there is anything wrong about the package, like you had a typo, misformed something, you would see that immediately here. So it could be the case that you would go immediately to check the API requests, and you wouldn't see any of them, and that's okay if you would have here error, right? So if there is error deploying the package, you won't see a request for API access because that doesn't come through yet. So always check first whether the package is valid and whether there were no errors. With that in place, we go to the SharePoint Admin Center, and here we go to the API management. Let me refresh the page.
Crossing fingers. Oh, yeah.
And there is pending approval. Right, so here we can see that matches our AD app name, permissions that we included as well, and in here it says pending. So as such, we can either approve it or reject that. And for the sake of the demo, let's approve it, because otherwise we won't be able to show how it works.
Absolutely.
So we approve it. And then the interesting part here is that even though you can see which application requested it, once it is approved, it's approved to every single script running in your tenant. So it's requested by an app, but it applies to everybody. So now it is approved. And I guess the last step left is to add the web part to the page and see that it actually works, and that we can actually see the orders coming from our API. So here I am on other page. Let me edit the page and add the web part. Let me add it here. There should be a web part named orders. All is well. It is here. And it's loading orders. It's always... There you go. So these are our orders. Let me publish the page. And let me show you the network tab so that we can actually see the requests coming through. Let me refresh the page. And now when we will filter the request URLs like API orders, there you go, right? So here is the course request, because this is a cross-domain call. So it will always start first with course, which will check in browser whether that API supports cross-domain calls. If you didn't enable course, it would fail in this stage and you wouldn't be able to call anything. You wouldn't get anything else than an error in browser that would say that course isn't enabled for this API.
Yeah. And where did we... Yeah, let's have a look on this one, but let's have a look on the course setting as well. So where did we enable that?
Yeah, so here regarding course, if you go to functions all the way back, here is additional. So if you go to platform features, my settings are discarded. Very good. So under here, under the API group, there is course option. And in here, in our case, we allowed all origins, meaning any domain can issue a client-side call. But it could be as well that you will allow only your domain, meaning here you would specify M365X, 035 SharePoint.com.
Yeah.
Yes.
So technically, this is for the course filtering. So even though you have a star there, which will allow everything, it doesn't mean that it's still authenticated. So it doesn't really matter that much. So, but I'm sure you can really target that to a specific URL if you want to as well. So.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So let me discard that. We don't need to change any of that. And
that's a simple enough setting. Simple enough setting, right?
Exactly. And actually, the person who hosts the API decides that what are the different URLs that should be able to call, which also gives you additional means to control and govern the API.
Sure. Absolutely.
So now in our case, what you can see here is a GET request to our API. And in here, you can see request headers, the bearer token, the auth. And all of that, if you think about it, we didn't need to do any of that in our code. The only thing that we say, we want to have an AAD HTTP client tied to this AAD app, and then we call this URL. This is it. And this is exactly the benefit that you get when you use the AAD HTTP client over trying to do ADAP by yourself. Yeah. So all of that is already done and fixed. I guess this is it, unless I missed something.
No, I think we walked through the whole process. So, and like noted already in Azure side, so the process is pretty much the same if you're actually building the web API by yourself rather than using an Azure function. Because behind of every single, let's say, an API exposed functionality in Azure, there's a web application or an application entry. So you can go and configure the settings over there. But this really opens up a great deal of additional opportunities, absolutely, because your Azure API could use, let's say, service bus or gateways to get to your LOB data in on-premises if needed, and there's massive amount of different additional opportunities with this. So great stuff. Cool. But let's move back on the slides and close up the webcast. And thank you, Waldek, for that one. Good demo on walking through the different scenarios. And like we did on the intro of the demo, it's a relatively simple scenario. To be fair, it is not that much complex. How could that be more complex than that? But at least the sample was simple. Let's put it this way, right?
Oh, right. Absolutely. And I guess that was it wasn't the point to build a fully fledged API that does 2 million things, right? The point being, how do you get past auth? Because oftentimes we hear that a lot. Like, what is the most important part of building something in 365? Auth. It's every single time. No matter if you want to communicate with Graph or SharePoint or anything else, you first need to authenticate. And many people find that a challenging part. And now we see that even if you build your own API, you want to secure it with AAD, and it's exactly the same thing. Before you can use that API and everything that it offers, you first have to authenticate, and that's the first hurdle that you have to go through. And now we've seen that part is easy. So with that, you can just tick it off, and then focus on actually your application.
Yep, absolutely. That simplicity of it's such a classic thing. Even so, let's say Microsoft Craft uses and everything else. It's like, that sounds really interesting. How do I do the auth? How do I do the auth?
Yeah, exactly.
Everything else. And I can't get to it. I need to do the auth. So this is really an abstracting the complexity of the classic ADAL handling, ADAL.js handling, everything else away from from you. So you can, when you're writing stuff from a SharePoint platform, well, that's typically what SharePoint actually does. We remove the complexity on underlying plumbing. That's really the role of SharePoint as a platform as well. Cool. I think that's it for this one. So thank you, Waldek, for the great demo, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.
Bye.